Chapter 26, Prelude to Destruction. To a casual observer of the Mormon scene in the spring of 1844, it must have seemed that Joseph Smith was riding higher than ever before. Except for the fulminations of the anti-Mormons at Warsaw and Carthage, there was little overt resentment against him or his people. His presidential campaign was winning him publicity, and, by lifting the Mormon vote out of party politics, seemed likely to mollify certain of the antagonisms arising from political issues. Actually, the enmity against the Mormons was widespread and dangerous. Those who took Joseph's campaign seriously saw him as an evil symbol of the union of church and state, and others suspected that he would eventually renounce his candidacy and declare for a popular candidate. The Masons, annoyed at rumors of corruption of the Masonic ritual in the Mormon lodges, which now numbered 5, 3 in Nauvoo and 2 in Iowa, and furious at Joseph's refusal to send the lodge records to Springfield for inspection, were determined to revoke the dispensations and declare all the Mormon lodges clandestine. The anti-Mormons were passing resolutions calling for Joseph's extradition and hoping for some provocation from Nauvoo that would furnish an excuse for action. But Joseph's worst peril, as he understood perfectly, was ripening within his own kingdom. "My life is more in danger from some little doughhead of a fool in this city than from all my numerous and inveterate enemies abroad," he declared. "I am exposed to far greater danger from traitors among ourselves than from enemies without. I can live as Caesar might have lived, were it not for a right-hand Brutus. We have a Judas in our midst." Footnote. This was from an address on December 29, 1843. For many months now, Joseph had been watching the progressive alienation of one of his ablest and most courageous men. William Law had been his second counselor for more than 2 years, proving as steadfast and incorruptible as John C. Bennett had been treacherous and dissolute. Law had come from Canada a wealthy man. He had invested in real estate, construction, and steam mills, fostering more than anyone else the sorely needed industrialization of the city. In the beginning, Law hid his resentment over the prophet's monopoly of the management of real estate in and about the city, though he thought it unseemly in a man of God. He had been particularly shocked when Joseph threatened to excommunicate any wealthy convert who came to Nauvoo and purchased land without his counsel. Finally, he came to mistrust Joseph's business judgment and refused to invest money in the publication of the revised version of the Bible, placing his funds instead in a steam mill and hemp farm. The prophet was constantly pleading for money to build the temple in the Nauvoo house, which Law thought might well be delayed until the acute housing shortage in the city was alleviated. The temple was now the chief spectacle on the upper Mississippi, but the workmen who sweated over its great stones were living on parched corn. The Nauvoo house, on the other hand, despite generous donations and liberal purchases of stock, seemed scarcely to be growing at all. Law became convinced, whether rightly or wrongly, that Joseph was using the funds donated for the hotel to buy more land, which he then sold for a generous profit to new converts. Eventually, Law and Robert Foster, who were the chief contractors in the city, began to beat against the autarkic economy that hemmed them in. They purchased part of the lumber floated down from the Mississippi from Wisconsin, which had been intended exclusively for church buildings, and began to build houses and stores. Since they paid wages, while the prophet paid the workmen on the temple and in the Nauvoo house in goods and city scrip, a nasty labor crisis resulted. Joseph called upon the workmen to continue the church projects and deplored Foster's mammoth skeletons rising all over the town. "There is no flesh on them," he cried. "They are all for personal interest and aggrandizement. I want the Nauvoo house built. It must be built. Our salvation depends upon it. I will say to those who have labored on the Nauvoo house and cannot get their pay, be patient, and if any man takes the means which are set apart for the building of the house and applies it to his own use, let him, for he will destroy himself. If any man is hungry, let him come to me, and I will feed him at my table. I will divide with them to the last morsel, and then if the man is not satisfied, I will kick his backside." The rift between William Law and the prophet thus began in a fundamental divergence of economic attitudes. The final break in their friendship, however, came from a question not of finance, but of fidelity. With sorrow and suspicion, Law watched Joseph ever enlarging his circle of wives. Then the prophet tried to approach Law's own wife, Jane. In a violent session with his leader, Law called for a reformation and an end to the debauchery that was corrupting the church. Joseph argued, pleaded, and quoted the Old Testament to no avail. Law threatened that unless Joseph went before the high council and confessed his sins and promised repentance, he would expose his seductions before the whole world. "I'll be damned before I do," Law later quoted Joseph as saying, "If I admitted to the charges you would heap upon me, it would prove the overthrow of the church." Is that not inevitable already? Law demanded. Then we can all go to hell together and convert it into heaven by casting the devil out. Hell is by no means the place this world of fools suppose it to be, but on the contrary, it is quite an agreeable place. Outraged by the prophet's banter, Law turned on his heel, saying bitterly, "You can enjoy it then, but as for me, I will serve the Lord our God." This was the beginning of Law's apostasy, but for some months an open break was avoided. Like so many other disaffected members, Law believed Joseph to be not a false, but a fallen prophet, led into iniquity by the teachings of John C. Bennett and his own hot passions. He clung to Joseph's earliest revelations, to the original purity of the gospel message which had made him a convert, and hoped that something would bring the prophet to his senses. The 1843 election had given the saints their first inkling that Law was in disfavor, and when Joseph denounced the Judas in Nauvoo, many of them guessed whom he was accusing. Law was privately told that the destroying angels had orders to put him out of the way, and though Joseph elaborately denied this story before a city council, Law was not wholly reassured. Together with his brother Wilson, he began to gravitate into the camp of other disgruntled Mormons. Here were William Marks, Austin Cowles, and Leonard Sobey, bitterly opposed to polygamy. There was young Francis Higbee, who had never forgiven the prophet for publicly denouncing him as a debauched and profligate during the Bennett scandal, and his brother Chauncey, whose reputation in Nauvoo was little better. Hiram Kimball was almost ready to join their ranks. Since he owned a good portion of the land along the river and had built many of the steamboat wharves, he expected to collect the wharfage himself, but Joseph insisted that it was a city prerogative and publicly threatened to blow up the steamboats that did not pay. Kimball, like Law, was further embittered by jealousy, since Joseph had once coveted his wife Sarah, and had tried in 1842 to win her for a spiritual wife. Chief among the dissenters was Dr. Robert D. Foster, whose own grievances strikingly paralleled those of Kimball and William Law. For a long time he had resented the prophet's opposition to his business ventures, but still looked to him for guidance in spiritual matters. Then one day in the spring of 1844 he arrived home unexpectedly from a business trip to discover the prophet dining with his wife. When Joseph left and Foster demanded to know the purpose of his coming, Mrs. Foster refused to talk. Quick to anger and inordinately jealous, he drew his pistol and threatened to shoot her if she did not divulge everything the prophet had said. Gray and terrified, the woman still was silent. Then, in a melodramatic frenzy, Foster seized a double-barreled pistol, thrust it into her hand, and shouted for her to defend herself. "If you don't tell me, either you or I will shoot." Thereupon she fainted. When she recovered, she confessed that the prophet had been preaching the spiritual wife doctrine and had endeavored to seduce her. Foster told this story to a little knot of disaffected Mormons gathered together in a corner grocery store, the Laws, Higbees, and the ne'er-do-well Joseph H. Jackson, and several others. It was the signal for a complete confession. One by one the men cast off reserve and unburdened their souls. Chauncey Higbee vowed that some of the leading elders had as many as 10 or 12 wives apiece, and described how they had recorded the names of all the women they wished to marry in a large book, called the Book of the Law of the Lord, kept at the home of Hiram Smith. After the names were inscribed, he said, the book was sealed, and the seals were broken in the presence of the unsuspecting women, who were thereby convinced that the doctrine was true and that they must submit. Jackson, who had sought unsuccessfully for the hand of Hiram Smith's daughter and had long been plotting revenge, intimated that a conspiracy was brewing that would cost the lives of every Smith in Nauvoo within a fortnight. 2 of the men who listened to these stories scurried off to the prophet, and once he ordered them to write down everything in complete detail, including Foster's account of the attempted seduction of his wife, and on April 17 he published these sworn testimonies in the Nauvoo Neighbor. He did not deign to deny the stories, letting the shock of publication suffice to convince his people that they were lies. Foster's trial was set for April 20, 1844, but when it was learned that he had marshaled 41 witnesses and intended to turn the trial into an indictment of the prophet, a council met secretly in advance and excommunicated him along with William, Wilson, and Jane Law. The schism thus created in Nauvoo was small but dangerous. Although they were pariahs within the city, the apostates did not leave. It was not alone their business holdings that kept them there. William Law had courage, tenacity, and a strange, misguided idealism. Although he was surrounded chiefly by men who believed Joseph to be a base impostor, he clung to the hope that he could effect a reformation in the church. To this end he set up a church of his own, with himself as president, following faithfully the organization of the main body. This in itself would not have been serious, for Joseph had seen rival prophets spring out of the grass at his feet before, and they had come to naught. Usually they tried to imitate him, giving out revelations that sounded stale and flat beside his own, prophesying wildly and organizing badly. But Law was cut to a different pattern. Actually, he was on the road to complete and ugly disillusionment, but he was walking backwards away from the church, looking eagerly for something in the landscape to which he could cling, grasping at every tree and hedgerow. His desperate desire to reform the church made him far more formidable than if he had set out to damn the prophet and all his works. Unlike John C. Bennett, he was willing to glove his mailed fist. And more important, he and Foster had enough money to buy a printing press. The Reformed Church was to have a mouthpiece 6 weeks after it was born, in a newspaper styled the Nauvoo Expositor. While they were waiting for the press to arrive, the apostates started a three-pronged attack on Joseph through the courts. Francis Higbee sued him for $5,000 on a charge of slander. William Law succeeded in getting a grand jury in Carthage to issue a bill of indictment against him for adultery and polygamy, and Jackson and Foster got a similar indictment for false swearing. Joseph was not afraid of what the laws might swear against him in a Carthage court, for he knew that they would be hard-pressed to prove him guilty. For 3 years his clerks had accompanied him everywhere, writing down everything he had said and done. Every day was accounted for, and all references to plural marriages had been so adroitly disguised that only the initiated would understand their true significance. Of this he had made sure. Francis Higbee's assault on the prophet was countered with a campaign of defamation the like of which Nauvoo had not seen since the expulsion of Bennett. Joseph charged Higbee with perjury, seduction, and adultery, giving details that the staid Times and Seasons admitted were too indelicate for the public eye and ear. Brigham Young swore that Higbee consorted with prostitutes, from whom he had once contracted a venereal disease. Another witness even identified the source of infection as a French prostitute from Warsaw, and said Bennett had given him medical assistance and the prophet had even tried to heal him by prayer. Chauncey Higbee was attacked with the same violent invective in the Nauvoo Neighbor of May 29, when the editor ransacked the secret files of testimony collected in the Bennett scandal and published the old affidavits of 3 women under whom Higbee had seduced with the promise of marriage under the spiritual wife code. So the mud flew back and forth. Publication of such documents was the worst sort of defensive strategy, since Joseph could not escape being involved by implication. Those who believed staunchly in his denials of polygamy were bewildered by the prodigious perjury of the apostates, and sensitive Mormons who knew something of the truth about polygamy remembered with pain the injunction of Jesus, "He that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone." Joseph's excesses had cost him what he needed more than anything else, a few months of peace in Nauvoo unmarred by political or personal scandal. Such a period would have seen the election over and some sort of solution for the westward migration worked out. Polygamy could have been sufficiently hidden to keep the Gentiles quiet and his new converts loyal. Then in Texas or Oregon some isolated valley in the Rocky Mountains he could have taught his people the truth. But he was blind to his own danger, and in a public sermon on May 26 pressed the savage attack against the apostates with an irresponsible gasconade. "The Lord has constituted me so curiously that I glory in persecution. If oppression will make a wise man mad, much more a fool. If they want a beardless boy to whip around all the world, I will get on top of a mountain and crow like a rooster. I shall always beat them. When facts are proved, truth and innocence will prevail at last. Come on, ye prosecutors, ye false swearers, all hell boil over. Ye burning mountains, roll down your lava, for I will come out upon the top at last. I have more to boast of than any man ever had. I am the only man that has ever been able to keep a whole church together since the days of Adam. I boast that no man ever did a work such as I. How I do love to hear the wolves howl. God knows, then," he concluded, "that the charges against me are false. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can find only one. I am the same man and am as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers." Had John C. Bennett been editor of the Nauvoo Expositor instead of William Law and Sylvester Emmons, it would have been a lurid sheet. But Law was no cheap scandalmonger and had a profound pity for the plural wives in Nauvoo. He vowed that nothing carnal should creep into the Expositor, and the first issue, which appeared on June 7, 1844, was therefore, considering the facts at the editor's disposal, an extraordinarily restrained document. The chief editorial mentioned no names, but simply described the story of a typical English girl coming alone to Nauvoo and being carefully indoctrinated in the mysteries of the kingdom by the prophet. This was followed by 3 affidavits signed by William Law, Jane Law, and Austin Cowles, testifying that they had all seen or read the revelation granting every man the privilege of marrying 10 virgins and forgiving him all sins save the shedding of innocent blood. Polygamy was only the first of a long list of practices signaled out for attack. Against Joseph's attempt to unite church and state and his grasping for political power, the Expositor was most eloquent. We do not believe that God ever raised up a prophet to Christianize a world by political schemes and intrigue. It is not the way God captivates the heart of the unbeliever, but, on the contrary, by preaching truth in its own native simplicity. We will not, it said further in an unmistakable allusion to Joseph's kingship, acknowledge any man as king or lawgiver to the church, for Christ is our only king and lawgiver. The editor struck at Joseph's financial maneuvering and land speculation, at his constant denunciation of misery, and at his misuse of the privileges granted by the Nauvoo charters. They called for a repeal of the charters, disobedience to political revelations, an end to the abuses of unit power centered in the prophet, and the strongest censure of his moral imperfections. The expositor spread consternation throughout the city. Those who were practicing polygamy feared a massacre by the anti-Mormons. Those who had been kept in ignorance were overwhelmed by the realization that all the surreptitious gossip might, after all, be true. These waited in mixed anger and dismay for the prophet's answer. When the prophet read the expositor through, he knew that he was facing the gravest crisis of his life. The paper had put him on trial before his whole people. Perhaps if Joseph had faced them with the truth and had gone to platform in the unfinished temple and read the revelation on plural marriage to his church with his old magnificent assurance, he might have stripped the apostates of their chief weapon and freed his loyal followers from a burden of secrecy, evasion, and lying that was rapidly becoming intolerable. Had he bared his plans for going west, he could have given them hope and a challenge, but he had no courage for it. In spite of the elaborate metaphysics he had created to justify polygamy, in spite of all the Old Testament prophets who had lived it and the success of his own experimentation, the crisis found him soft-willed. He was empty of conviction when he needed it most. With a kind of desperation he turned to William Marks, who had so faithfully come to his rescue in past crises with his wisdom and liberal purse, but who in recent months had turned from him in sorrow. They walked down the street together in the bright summer sunlight, turned into a little used lane where they could talk in private, and sat down on the grassy bank. "We are a ruined people," Joseph began. "How so?" Marks asked guardedly, for he had so long kept a troubled silence that he no longer knew how to talk to his leader. "The doctrine of polygamy, or spiritual wife system, that has been taught and practiced among us, will prove our destruction and overthrow. I have been deceived. It is a curse to mankind, and we shall have to leave the United States soon, unless it can be put down and its practice stopped in the church." The older man was ready to weep with gratitude. This was what he had been hoping to hear ever since he had seen the cursed revelation on polygamy almost a year before. "Now, Brother Marks," Joseph went on, "you have not received this doctrine, and I want you to go into the High Council, and I will have charges preferred against all who practice this doctrine, and I want you to try them by the laws of the church and cut them off, if they will not repent and cease the practice of this doctrine. And I will go into the stand and preach against it with all my might, and in this way we will rid the church of this damnable heresy." But Joseph was only striking blindly for a way out of his dilemma, and the embarrassments of this particular solution must have made him discard it by sundown. He did not know what to do. Only one theme persisted in all of his agitation, a conviction that the expositor must be throttled. But here again he was betrayed by his utter incapacity for dealing skillfully with opposition, a weakness that his political and legal successes in Nauvoo had served only to intensify. He had become an autocrat who could think only in terms of suppression. Calling together the city council, he ordered a trial, not of the apostates, but of the expositor itself. It was a strange, high-handed proceeding. There were no jury, no lawyers, no witnesses for the defense. The counselors simply stood up, one after another, and accused the editors of seduction, pandering, counterfeiting, and thievery. The prophet went so far as to say that the apostate Joseph H. Jackson had been proved a murderer before the city council. Then he went on to add one more to his list of denials of polygamy by declaring that the revelation on polygamy referred to in the expositor was an answer to a question concerning things which transpired in former days and had no reference to the present time. The city council now declared that the press was libelous and must be destroyed. Joseph issued a proclamation declaring it a civic nuisance. A portion of the legion marched to the office, wrecked the press, pied the type, and burned every issue of the hated paper that could be found. The Expositor was neither the first nor the last Illinois paper to be so destroyed. Burning abolitionist presses was something of a sport close to the Mason-Dixon line, but for a leader of a hated minority to indulge in this sport was not frontier license, but a violation of the Holy Constitution. It was a greater breach of political and legal discipline than the anti-Mormons could have hoped for. Joseph could not have done better for his enemies, since he had at last given them a fighting moral issue. The apostates fled to Warsaw and Carthage. Robert Foster wrote for the Warsaw Signal a detailed statement in which he not only described the destruction of the press, but also accused Joseph of a long list of crimes. from the hiring of Porter Rockwell to kill Boggs to the seduction of innumerable Mormon women. History affords no parallel to the iniquities and enormities of this tyrant, he concluded, who, dressed in a little brief authority, perpetrates deeds at which heaven weeps and human nature falls back ashamed of her own depravity. Thomas Sharp's editorial on June 12th screamed with demoniac fury. War and extermination is inevitable. Citizens, arise, one and all. Can you stand by such and suffer such infernal devils to rob men of their property and rights without avenging them? We have no time for comments. Every man will make his own. Let it be made with powder and balls. Joseph too late saw that he had loosed an avalanche. He wrote a long defensive letter to Governor Ford justifying the destruction of the press on legal grounds, and dispatched orders to the 12 apostles to return home at once with powder, lead, and a rifle packed discreetly in their luggage. And then he went to instruct the legion in the defense of the city. Mounting with a reviewing stand, his blue and buff uniform blazoned with gilt buttons and epaulettes, he stood proudly before his men, betraying nothing of the tumult and anxiety racking him within. He made a dogged defense of the legality of his position. Since the burning of the press, Law and Foster had secured warrants for his arrest on the charge of riot, which with his usual dexterity he had evaded through the habeas corpus procedure of the Nauvoo Municipal Court. But this he knew was little more than a postponement. Hourly scouts were bringing him word of the angry crowds that were swarming the streets of Carthage and Warsaw. Missourians and Iowans were crossing the river in droves, attracted like flies to the smell of blood. Armed bands already were threatening isolated Mormon families and driving them into Nauvoo. There was lynch talk everywhere, always in the name of justice and liberty. Joseph read to his men the inflammatory editorial of the Warsaw Signal Extra so that they should be under no illusions about what faced them. Then he said, "We are American citizens. We live upon a soil for the liberties of which our fathers periled their lives and spilt their blood on the battlefield. Those rights so dearly purchased shall not be disgracefully trodden underfoot by lawless marauders without at least a noble effort on our part to sustain our liberties. Will you stand by me to the death?" The thousands arrayed beneath him, stiff and serious in their well-ordered ranks, shouted in unison a thunderous, "Aye! It is well. If you had not done it, I would have gone out there." And he swept his arm to the west, and would have raised up a mightier people. Then drawing his sword from his scabbard, Joseph thrust it heavenward and shouted in a voice that carried over the ranks of the army and down the city streets, "I call God and angels to witness that I have unsheathed my sword with a firm and unalterable determination that this people shall have their legal rights and be protected from mob violence, or my blood shall be spilt upon the ground like water, and my body consigned to the silent tomb."